Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. In the words of one person who played an outside role, a role bigger than arguably just about anyone else in helping to propel Donald Trump to the White House, the Epstein case is now, quote, a line in the sand. Joe Rogan, whose last-minute endorsement of Donald Trump back in November generated endless political debates among Democrats about whether Kamala Harris should have gone on his show, wondering if it would have been determinative in November's outcome. That guy, Joe Rogan, is out with a crystal clear warning for Donald Trump that Trump's evasiveness and Trump's gaslighting on the Epstein case is hurting his credibility now on everything else. Watch.
This is a line in the sand.
Yeah.
This one's
Yeah.
a line in the sand.
Yeah.
Because this is one where there's a lot of stuff about, you know, when we thought Trump was going to come in and a lot of things are going to be resolved.
Yeah.
We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to figure everything out. And when you have this one hardcore line in the sand that everybody had been talking about forever, and then they're trying to gaslight you on that.
Rogan also ripped to shreds the defense that Team Trump has argued and played on his show. Here's what he said about FBI Director Kash Patel's appearance on his show last month.
The Epstein stuff is so crazy because when Kash Patel was on here and he was like, there's nothing. And I was like, what are you talking?
Yeah.
I didn't even know what to say. My thought was, and people are like, why didn't you push back more? My thought was like, I'm just going to put this out there and let the internet do its work because there's nothing I can. The guy's saying there's no tapes, there's no video. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone knows it doesn't make any sense. The whole thing was nuts. And then he's like, well, we have a film. We're going to release that film. And the film has a minute missing from it.
Yeah.
Like, do you think we're babies? Like, what is this?
So much to unpack there, right? But part of the reason that Rogan said that Epstein is a, quote, line in the sand, part of what he argues, part of what the complaint is centered around, is that Donald Trump is now at the center of so many more unanswered questions that seem to multiply with every comment Trump makes. On Monday, Trump said this.
For years, I wouldn't talk to Jeffrey Epstein. I wouldn't talk because he did something that was inappropriate. He hired help. And I said, don't ever do that again. He stole people that worked for me. I said, don't ever do that again. He did it again. And I threw him out of the place, persona non grata. I threw him out, and that was it. I'm glad I did, if you want to know the truth. And by the way, I never went to the island, and Bill Clinton went there supposedly 28 times. I never went to the island, but Larry Summers, I hear, went there. He was the head of Harvard. And many other people that are very big people. Nobody ever talks about them. I never had the privilege of going to his island. And I did turn it down, but a lot of people in Palm Beach were invited to his island. In one of my very good moments, I turned it down. I didn't want to go to his island.
What? What? They break up as friends because he, quote, stole people from him? People are property? And then Trump claims he never had the privilege of going to the island? Okay. Is it best a curious and ill-advised choice of words to call that a privilege? But also this stealing of people from him as though those people were his property and Epstein stole his property? It's a fair interpretation of those comments. We recall that the Trump administration has been saying that Epstein and Trump had a falling out because Epstein was a, quote, creep. That's been the line from the press folks. Trump was asked now about these conflicting answers today, and that led reporters to ask more questions. Listen.
You said yesterday your falling out with Jeffrey Epstein was over him taking some of the workers from your business. But your administration in the past said that you threw him out because he was a creep. So can you explain that discrepancy?
Well, maybe they're the same thing, you know, it's sort of a little bit of the same thing. But no, he took people that worked for me, and I told him don't do it anymore, and he did it. And I said, stay the hell out of here.
Yes, they were young women. What did they do?
In the spa.
Jobs in the spa.
Yeah, people that work in the spa. I have a great spa, one of the best spas in the world at Mar-a-Lago. And people were taken out of the spa, hired by him. In other words, gone. And other people would come and complain, this guy is taking people from the spa. I didn't know that. And then when I heard about it, I told him, I said, listen, we don't want you taking our people, whether it was spa or not spa. I don't want him taking people. And he was fine. And then not too long after that, he did it again. And I said, out of here.
Mr. President, did one of those stolen, persons, does that include Virginia Jeffrey?
I don't know. I think she worked at the spa. I think so. I think that was one of the people. Yeah. He stole her. And by the way, she had no complaints about us, as you know. None whatsoever.
What year is it? What are we talking about? Trump is talking in that sound you just listened to about a victim named Virginia Giuffre. She's one of Jeffrey Epstein's better known victims. We know a lot about her as a victim. She died by suicide this April. In the midst of all this, Trump is trying to refocus attention on Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice and longtime girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, whose attorney has made clear that she would like a pardon or commutation. For what? It's not clear. Today, she told Congress she would testify only under immunity. Some of Trump's media allies are already laying the groundwork for Trump to comply with that request and grant her clemency. Listen to MAGA influencer Charlie Kirk.
If anybody actually has the information of what has happened around Jeffrey Epstein, it's not going to be some James Comey created file. It is going to be Ghislaine Maxwell.
But do you know who created the Ghislaine Maxwell? Well, forget it. I know we're not on Earth One anymore. So for those of you interested in how this goes on Earth Two, here's how the new narrative that Joe Rogan, for one, isn't buying goes. The files created by the investigators that sent Ghislaine Maxwell to prison and before he committed suicide, Jeffrey Epstein to jail, those files are a hoax. But Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted, will singularly tell a truth that can't be found in the files, I guess. It's not clear even from the MAGA telling, which again, Joe Rogan, for his part, isn't buying. It's not clear how a pardon for Maxwell, a convicted sex trafficker, a convicted predator, convicted felon, it's not clear how pardoning that person would sit with the American public or even Trump's base of supporters. Charlie Kirk is trying. He's laying the groundwork just in case. Not to say anything of how any of Epstein or Maxwell's victims would feel about a pardon.
And then there's Trump's other very, I guess, personal attorney, Alina Habba. Trump appointed her to be the interim U.S. attorney for New Jersey, despite a complete lack of qualifications for the job and a history of saying things like this.
Somebody said to me, Alina, would you rather be smart or pretty? And I said, oh, easy, pretty. I can fake being smart.
I don't know if you can, Alina. That's the thing. Now, U.S. attorneys are really not supposed to be lackeys for the president, just to state the obvious. There's only 93 of them across the country. And under the law, Trump could only make Alina Habba or anyone else who's in this position interim U.S. attorney for 120 days. After that 120 days was up, judges for the Federal District Court in New Jersey, they got to decide whether or not to keep her in that job. And those judges chose not to let Habba keep serving as U.S. attorney, choosing another prosecutor to replace her. And then the Trump administration abruptly fired Habba's replacement and took advantage of a loophole in the law to put Habba back in the job. They essentially made Alina Habba her own assistant so that once the job was open, she could step in and fill the role, even though her time is up. It's a completely blatant end run around the normal process for making sure that U.S. attorneys are qualified and impartial prosecutors. And the Trump administration is doing this to install loyalists as U.S. attorneys all across the country. In the Northern District of New York, Trump appointed a man named John Sarconi to be the interim U.S. attorney. Just like Alina Habba, he served for 120 days, after which the judges in that district chose to kick him out of that job. And just like Alina Habba, the Trump administration kept him in that job by making him his own assistant. What a trick. Same thing in Nevada. Trump appointed a member of the Republican National Committee for the nonpartisan role of U.S. Attorney. More than 100 retired federal and state judges wrote the court opposing her nomination specifically. But Trump used a similar trick to keep her in that role as well. And then there's Trump's pick to be the U.S. Attorney in the Central District of California, a former Republican state lawmaker with a long history as a bit of a conservative crusader. Now, since taking that job, he has brought federal charges against a California union leader arrested in an ICE protest. He stood idly by during the violent detention of U.S. Senator Alex Padilla, who was tackled to the ground trying to ask a question at a press conference. He's pushed prosecutors to bring more cases against immigrants, even when those cases lack evidence. Under Azali, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Central California has already lost a third of its career staff. No wonder why. And just today, his office dropped a fraud case against a fast food chain owner and major Trump donor who the Justice Department has called a serial tax cheat. Now the Trump administration has used that same trick to keep him in that job as well. There are 93 U.S. attorneys serving in all 50 states plus U.S. territories. They are the ones in charge of prosecuting any federal crime that happens within their jurisdiction. Medicaid fraud, financial crimes, even terrorism cases all end up on the desk of U.S. attorneys. That's why that job is supposed to be completely apolitical. But Trump is taking unprecedented steps to put his own handpicked people in at least some of those key jobs. And they all know that to keep those jobs, they will need to be loyal foot soldiers for Trump. Trump's own personal attorneys have provided them all the example and role modeling that they need. Joining me now is one of my favorite legal minds, probably one of yours too. He's Andrew Weissmann. You know he's a former FBI general counsel and former assistant U.S. attorney, as well as an MSNBC legal analyst. Okay, Andrew, there are so many things I want to ask you about. I just want to start with the Bovee news because he was just confirmed in about the last 15 minutes. You understand very well the importance of the Third Circuit Court specifically. I believe you've brought cases there. What are the consequences of Bovee sitting on that bench for a lifetime appointment?
Well, I think one has to zoom out and think about this in terms of what it says about checks and balances in this country. The fact that Congress, if you needed any more proof that Congress is asleep at the switch and has become sort of a lapdog to Donald Trump, at least the Republican-controlled Congress, this is an example. This is not a normal candidate, and the amount of proof as to why he is unfit is sort of overwhelming. And second, if you think about that in terms of what has happened to one check, which is Congress, this is another attack on the only other branch that it has served to be a check, which is the courts. And you either can try and intimidate them, you can file complaints, as they did just yesterday against the chief judge in D.C., Judge Boasberg, or you can try and sort of pack the courts, which is what you're doing with this nomination that it's now been confirmed. And so I think if you just think about it in terms of checks and balances, this is a nail in the coffin of that system that we have had for over 200 years in this country. And he is really exhibit A. In some ways, I might say exhibit Z to this because there have been so many, but I think that's what it means to me tonight.
Yeah, it's putting it in stark terms, but those are required. Let me ask you, I mean, because one of the other things I know you've been following, we've been following, I just talked a lot about, is just this end run on U.S. attorneys and putting them in place in acting positions. And New Jersey, Alina Habba, of course, is the example in New Jersey. Everybody's heard of her, knows her name, and there's been some real consequences already. I mean, a defendant has sued to get his case thrown out, pretrial conferences and hearings set for defendants to enter pleas were called off. There's a lot of things happening. According to Politico, there are about 1,500 criminal cases in the District of New Jersey a year. I'm sure it fluctuates. But help us understand, that's been a day or a few days. What could happen if she insists and they insist in keeping her in this job?
So in all of the districts that you mentioned, Jen, where they've done this sort of end run, there is zero reason, if you are defense counsel for a defendant who's now been charged, not to bring a challenge saying that this is not a duly authorized U.S. attorney, and that this is legally questionable. So there will be that litigation. But again, if you step back again, Jen, just to the norm here, it is unheard of that the judges do not just confirm and sort of go along with the person who served for the first 120 days. That's true of every administration. I've served in so many Republican and Democratic administrations. The judges don't play politics in this. They're not concerned about the policy of the U.S. attorney as long as the person's qualified. So the big take home here is not just the end run, which will be legally challenged. It's the idea that these people were so unqualified that really, I think for the first time that I'm aware of in history, you have the judges saying, no, we're not actually going to go along with this because the person simply is not qualified to do this job. They're unfit for the position.
That is a really stunning thing, and it's an important reminder that that's not normal. I mean, these judges have decided they don't want to continue with a number of these U.S. attorneys Trump has named. It's also what it sounds like you're saying is that in all of these cases, and there could be more because other people could hit 120 days, defense attorneys might question whether or not they should move forward with cases.
Sure. Look, I've been a defense lawyer. There's zero reason not to question it and to have the courts rule in the various districts. I mean, there's zero downside for it. You may not win, but it's certainly against the spirit of the law, if not the letter of the law. And that's the kind of thing that you can bring to the courts and let them decide whether this was done appropriately. But again, even if the courts were to say that legally the Trump administration could do this end run, what does it tell you about the qualifications and what is going on? The big picture of these people are so unqualified that you have judges of all stripes, of all political persuasions, saying we're not going to go along with this. To me, that is sort of the take home for the American public.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you as always for providing lots of direct clarity. Really appreciate you joining me tonight. Thank you again.
Nice to be here.
Do you remember when Donald Trump said this during his address to a joint session of Congress in March?
I'm fighting every day to reverse this damage and make America affordable again.
Fast forward almost 5 months, and he's done pretty much the exact opposite. And Americans are starting to take notice. A recent CBS News poll shows 70% of Americans think Donald Trump is not focusing enough on lowering prices. 64% disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of inflation. 60% oppose Donald Trump's tariffs on imports. Many U.S. businesses are still bracing for the full impact of Trump's tariffs. NPR reports, as President Donald Trump prepares to announce new tariff increases, the costs of his policies are starting to come into focus for a domestic manufacturing sector that depends on global supply chains, with a new analysis suggesting factory costs could increase by roughly 2% to 4.5%. Those increases will likely be passed on to Americans who are already feeling the squeeze because, well, the rent is too damn high. Fortune magazine reports U.S. median rent has risen from about $824 in 2008 to more than $1,300 in 2025. As rent has increased faster than wages, Americans are spending much more of their income on housing. On average, it now takes an entire week's worth of pay to afford monthly rent. And buying a home is becoming less and less attainable. The Wall Street Journal reports individual home buyers are largely locked out of the housing market as home prices continue to climb and interest rates remain stuck. But investors are buying and dominating the market. So far in 2025, investors who buy homes to flip or rent out have made up about 30% of purchases of both existing and newly built single-family homes, the highest share on record, according to property analytics firm Cotality, which started tracking the sales 14 years ago. That's where my next guest, Democratic Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware, is trying to step in. A bipartisan housing package she's been working on was marked up in an executive session of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee today.
I think about the fact that in my state, veterans have come to me and said, I'm concerned about losing my home. I think about the young couple who say, I can't afford to even think about buying a house. But more importantly, I think about kids that I saw in school auditoriums when I was a congressperson, second graders who said that they were concerned about homelessness. And when I asked why, they said, because I have a friend who lives in their car. That's what this is about to me.
Joining us now is Democratic Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware. She is a member of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee and the Health Committee. Senator, thank you for being here. Tell us more about this bipartisan housing package.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jonathan. It is good to be with you. And I think, even starting with the issue of affordability that you just brought up, I mean, we hear across the country that housing is unattainable for many families. And this has been decades in the making. And so today, the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, under the leadership of Senator Tim Scott and Ranking Member Elizabeth Warren, the whole committee voted on a major package of bills. 3 of my bills were included in that package. And as I said, this is really about the American people. And we want that dream to be not just reachable, but within real reach for them. And so we have bills that will deal with issues of increasing the supply of housing. That's one of the reasons why housing costs are so high, because you're competing for a limited number. One of the bills that I have, it creates something called to accelerate that, it creates these things called pattern books. Here's an example to deal with zoning issues. Mm-hmm. To deal with zoning issues so that get a pre-approved plan. That way you don't have to spend the time, you don't have to spend the money. We can increase that affordability. But this plan also, the package also dealt with issues of investing in affordable housing. It deals with cutting red tape. It deals with all the things that make us more competitive and able to build more housing in this country so that people can afford it. And this is across the board. And so really excited, because there aren't many times in your life where you get to do something and you say, this will make a big difference in people's lives. And that's with the introduction, this first step in this housing, the Road to Housing Act is all about.
Mm-hmm. Senator, last week, Donald Trump signed an executive order which removes homeless people from the streets of U.S. cities and put them in mental health institutions or drug treatment centers without their consent. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm not surprised. We look at the actions that this administration has done that are really inhumane. As you talked about affordability and tariffs, I think about the fact that while this administration is giving major tax breaks to billionaires and the ultra-rich and corporations, with these tariffs, they're actually putting a tax on the American people. We look at how folks have been treated, even the issue of cutting Medicaid. He said he wasn't going to cut Medicaid, wasn't going to touch it. They've actually gone about trying to rip Medicaid away from millions of Americans. He said he was going to do 90 deals on tariffs in 90 days. I don't think he's done 10. And that's, I think, why this whole Epstein thing is also something that rings true for people, because it's, promises made and promises broken. And the reality is, with the families and the individuals that you just talked about, these are real people. These are our neighbors, our cousins, our brothers. And so we're going to continue to fight and stand up for those individuals as we do our work in the Senate.
Senator, voters are giving the president poor marks on the economy. How is it feeling to people in Delaware?
Yeah, people in Delaware, they come up to me and they tell me they're concerned. One of the reasons why I focused on housing was because it was one of the #1 issues that I heard up and down the state. But again, as we look at the lack of a really cohesive strategy for how we're dealing with issues of the economy, it's why we're seeing what we're seeing. It's one thing to think that he's been able to keep prices, stable. He said he was going to lower the cost of goods, and we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that in home building. We're not seeing that with the tariffs. We're not seeing that across the board. And so Delawareans are feeling it just like the rest of the country. And again, that's why we've got to come up with these things that are not just about what Donald Trump isn't doing, but what our vision is for the future. And to me, housing is one of those areas that touches everybody, no matter where you come from across this country, no matter what your persuasion. Housing is something that needs to be affordable, needs to be attainable, and is part of the American dream.
This is the story that has consumed Donald Trump as president for many days now, but of course, as a candidate for many months when he sold a certain version of it. His history with Epstein and those people and those victims are all something that he has had time to reflect on, and he seems to be unable to clearly explain what he did then, what the nature of their relationship was, how it ended, what he did or didn't say to him at the time. Maybe they were friends without any other crimes, but why deny and sue the Wall Street Journal over those alleged birthday salutations if that's all they were? These are the kind of questions that are dragging down Trump. And that's the Epstein history personally. That's before you even get to, of course, the handling of this in government. That MAGA and other critics are dealing with not only whatever Trump's personal history may or may not be, could be nothing of an ethical or legal dimension. That's possible. And he still has to answer for why there is the apparent secrecy, the broken vow to release material, and now what many podcasters and critics call a blatant cover-up. They put out a memo saying we can't release anything more. Days later, under pressure, Trump says we might release more. All of it looks like a Watergate of sex trafficking. Doesn't mean we know who was involved beyond what the case showed. I want to be very clear. I've said that repeatedly. But it does mean on the cover-up side, there are questions that are just not being answered, whether that's from reporters, MAGA allies, legal analysts, and we've heard, of course, from some victims who've also criticized the Trump government administration's handling of this, totally separate from whatever happened back at Mar-a-Lago. In Washington, Republicans are subpoenaing Maxwell, partly because they apparently don't think that whatever DOJ did is enough. They want to talk to her themselves. And some Democrats say what DOJ did is suspicious. So again, a bipartisan view that other government officials are breaking with Trump and want to handle this separately because they don't trust him. Maxwell even saying she would testify to the Congress under conditions like immunity and getting some briefing about advanced questions. Committee says it won't try to grant her immunity. It's not even clear when you're already incarcerated in these federal crimes what other immunity would really be relevant, except for perhaps, of course, lying to Congress and perjury. Maxwell's lawyer, talking about Trump, says in the alternative, were she to get, quote, clemency, she'd be willing and eager to testify openly and honestly in public before Congress. Maxwell's attorney is basically telegraphing something in public. She is the one person who's paid the most for what was then defendant and then deceased Epstein's alleged crimes. He never went to trial on many of those sordid things. The idea that there's any discussion or open door to letting her out of prison right now is not only completely legally baseless and ethically curious, but it also would be the exact opposite of what MAGA and other folks said was so important about this story. Remember that Epstein and his co-conspirators did bad things. So why would Trump leave that door open? I'm asking these questions, but I'm not pretending these are just open, neutral. Some of these questions raise more questions, like why are we even talking about pardoning someone involved and convicted of the sex trafficking of minors? There's also heat on Trump from the right. We've seen this over the weeks. We saw it last week. We saw Rogan. Here is Megyn Kelly, who has been, especially in Trump's second term, a staunch MAGA ally on a ton of issues, some controversies, federal power, ICE, etc. Here's her scathing takedown on this governmental part. Remember what I told you, how this Trump administration itself has been handling this case.
It's the way they've handled the scandal has been so bad, leading everybody up to the water's edge and then not giving anyone a drink. It's like rule one of how not to play out a scandal. What do you think?
Completely agree. This is self-inflicted. First of all, nobody told Pam Bondi she had to issue that memo in the middle of a slow news summer where people would, of course, predictably be digesting it and the Republican base be horrified by it for the entire summer. That's really how this is unfolded. And whoever told the Justice Department that this could somehow be buried and that people would move on and that the Trump administration could get away with that ridiculous 2-page summation of you're not getting any more information because there's no there should be fired. That person is an idiot and didn't understand the Republican base, certainly the core MAGA base. So now can we really trust anything this woman says when it's either this, give something up or someone up or spend 20 years in jail? So they've really created this own pickle for themselves, and we still haven't had a presser by Pam Bondi or even a long-form interview. So it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for the complaints of why won't this go away?
We've heard from you about Trump, the politics of the right and MAGA, and the loyalty we're accustomed to seeing. Is this the biggest crack we've seen in the second term, and why is that loyalty fading?
Well, I think it is a huge crack because it's an article of faith on the right that there are a cabal of coastal elites who are engaged in some kind of underage sex trafficking. See the Comet Pizza story where their guy showed up. The problem is they were right, but it was one of their own. So that is just in ways that's inbred in them, like it's just part of their DNA, that entire narrative. And to some extent, they feel vindicated by this. See, we told you, these rich people, these New York finance people, these people in Palm Beach, they live by one set of rules, we live by another set of rules. And the actual theory of the case was pretty good. But it wasn't it wasn't Chuck Schumer. It was somebody else. And that's why they're having trouble dealing with this. And it just confirms a lot. And maybe the question that Megyn Kelly had and Molly was talking about, maybe there is no good answer. Sometimes that happens. They say, well, it's the way they put the information out. They don't have a very good response. Their responses cause us to ask more questions. Well, sometimes there just isn't a good answer. And I've talked to 5 different people today, and just out of theoretically, how would you handle this if you were there? Just assume this is you. Everybody came to the same conclusion. I don't know if there is a way to handle it. It's really
on
amazing.
That point, why do you think Trump's handling it so poorly? I mean, you've talked before because we come to you for blunt criticism, but you're not the guy who says Democrats are always perfect. You didn't tell us Biden was perfect. You talked about age and fitness before he dropped out. You've said that Trump has been effective at times and Democrats have not. But here it's the opposite. Here the PR wizard seems to be melting down and crashing out in public and saying things that no one would want to be their lead defense when these kind of questions are looming.
So maybe he's guilty. So maybe there is no, maybe he's scared to death at the more look. The other thing that's really interesting in here is the role of Melania and Jeffrey Epstein and Trump in the modeling business in New York City and Manhattan in the early 90s. I mean, that was a different world of event. And now, of course, you have Epstein. You have a guy that hangs himself in a jail cell. You had this guy, Jean-Luc Brunel, we forget about him, who has a modeling agency in Paris that hung himself. Maybe there's something really scandalous and really historic at the bottom of all this. I'm not saying, I don't have proof there is, but
we don't know. We're not reporting that. I understand.
Maybe this is one of these really weird coastal modeling agency sex trafficking things that lies at the core of this. We've got to consider that possibility.
Right. And that when you say consider the possibility, that's what happens in investigations that are run correctly. And you don't go around and say, oh, as the Wall Street Journal reports, if an important person's name was mentioned, whatever party, in this case, they report that Bondi told Trump it was Trump. That doesn't cool your heels on the release. But, of course, that brings us back to where we started, which is why, as you said, they may not have a good answer. It's also breaking through. I want to show a little late night and get your response to this.
The way they've handled the scandal has been so bad, leading everybody up to the water's edge and then not giving anyone a drink.
Completely agree. This is self-inflicted. Now the president's very annoyed that it won't go away. It won't go away because of the way he's handled it. They've really created this own pickle for themselves, and we still haven't had a presser by Pam Bondi or even a long-form interview. So it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for the complaints of why won't this go away?
I never had the privilege of going to his island.
You were doing really good right until privilege. Privilege was not the word you wanted to use. A trip to that terrible island was sadly not an honor that was ever bestowed upon me.
I'm sorry, what? What? You never had the privilege of going to Epstein's Island? Sadly, I never had the honor of dining with Jeffrey Dahmer. It just...
Trump said he was invited to the island but didn't want to go. I get it. It's so annoying when you get invited to a destination crime scene, isn't it?
I mean, James, this is everywhere. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hate to laugh because there are dead people involved here. There are females whose lives, there are young girls, now adults whose lives have been ruined forever. You saw you guys and Julia came around. But I'm sorry, you just can't help but bust out laughing at some of this. And again, I'd say to Piers, I'd say to Megyn Kelly, maybe there is no good answer. And sometimes that happens when you're in the middle of a PR crisis, is people kind of have it figured out. And if they try to give Maxwell a pardon, go look at the sentencing memo that the U.S. attorney put in the Southern District of New York. Look at what the judge said. They could have convicted her on 4 or 5 different charges of perjury. And then, Ari, we tend to forget, if they do pardon her, the New Mexico authorities might get involved because Epstein had a 7,500-acre ranch outside of Santa Fe, and there's stories about that being part of the stops on a travel log. I don't know, but I suspect there'll be some curiosity from maybe the statute of limitations is run. I don't know, but their questions are a lot. They got a lot. There's a lot. There's a lot of baseball left to play here.
Joining me now, Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor and an MSNBC contributor. Ben, Israel's staunchest supporters are being troubled in large part by images like the ones we're showing right now. This was a baby in Gaza who was delivered prematurely via C-section because their mother was killed in an Israeli airstrike. That child survived only a short time. Pictures of atrocities do have the power, as you know, to change hearts and minds in ways that can't be undone. Is there a point at which the horror that we're all witnessing unfold every day in Gaza becomes too much even for Netanyahu, who we just heard right now is denying what we're all looking at with our own eyes?
I mean, you would hope so, Chris. I mean, first of all, the facts are pretty clear on this. Since the collapse of the first ceasefire that was negotiated in March, Israel restricted all aid getting into the Gaza Strip. That included restrictions on things like baby formula. So that was a policy choice. And so this has been building for months. People have been warning about this for months. They've also kind of dismantled the capacity of the UN aid organization to deliberate into Gaza, and instead created this alternative mechanism, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is, by all accounts, is not capable of getting aid into Gaza, or not interested necessarily in getting the levels of aid that are needed to get in there. I think the question now is, in response to pressure, you've seen some kind of half measures. So you've seen the resumption of airdrops of food into Gaza. The problem is that's not going to be sufficient to stop what is a kind of cascading effect. Once a critical mass of the population is dealing with malnutrition, you kind of can't put Band-Aids on that with airdrops, which are inefficient ways of getting assistance in. You have to let these several hundred trucks of aid that are parked there on the border drive in. You have to give kind of unfettered access to deal with the scale of starvation. Netanyahu seems to be trying to balance the kind of far right of his coalition that wants to really depopulate Gaza. They say that out loud, and the international pressure he's under. So what he usually does is kind of half measures, right? Let those airdrops go forward, maybe let a trickle of aid in. That's not going to do it in this case, though. So I think the pressure is going to continue until there's a meaningful distribution of aid in Gaza, if not an end to the conflict altogether.
You heard me say this, Ben. Highly respected human rights groups in Israel are now accusing their own government of genocide, which is, of course, a highly sensitive word to the Jewish people. Does Netanyahu need to explain to the Israeli people and to the world why it's necessary to continue waging this war this way? It seems there's been no clear momentum since the last ceasefire ended.
No, and the military objective, he continues to say that the objective is to destroy Hamas. But at the same time, you have people in his own government, right? Israeli ministers talking about depopulating Gaza. You have proposals to start to annex parts of Gaza. So that raises the question of, well, what is the purpose of this military operation? And that's one of the reasons why you have those Israeli organizations talking about genocide. You had an Israeli genocide scholar write a similar piece for the New York Times. It's harder to determine what is the end state that Netanyahu is seeking here. Hamas clearly is not what it was on October 7th. And so why is the war going on? And I think unless and until there's a complete end to the military campaign and the restrictions on aid in Gaza, this pressure is going to continue. And again, I think the main thing people have to understand here is that, this is actually what a lot of people in Netanyahu's coalition want. And so in Israeli politics, there's a lot of people that want an end to the war. There's an increasing number of people who are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But there's also people who kind of want to kind of press forward and literally take the land. And he's yet to reconcile those differences. And time and again, he tends to side with the far right of his coalition because that's what keeps him in power. He's worried about his government collapsing if he loses that far right support, at which point he'd be vulnerable not just to an election, but to potential criminal prosecution, given some charges he faces in Israel.
And I wonder if you see alternatively, Ben, that this has reinvigorated the idea of a two-state solution. Do you see real momentum building toward establishing a Palestinian state?
Yes and no. You see, obviously, France has recognized a Palestinian state. They're having a conference dedicated to the creation of a Palestinian state. The UK kind of tentatively came along today. It's tied to the conflict in Gaza. So you may see more and more countries, out of a lack of any other thing to do, recognize the Palestinian state. The question is, what is that state going to be? The land would need to be in the West Bank and Gaza. There's increasing Israeli settlements into the West Bank and talk about taking land in Gaza. There's obviously a kind of tired and corrupt Palestinian Authority leadership in the West Bank and a destroyed Hamas leadership in Gaza. So who would lead a Palestinian state? So recognition is kind of the easy part. The question becomes, well, where is this Palestinian state going to be and who's going to be able to run it? And I think that's when things get a lot more challenging. But I think people are just trying to give a horizon of some hope that there could be a resolution to this conflict. But that doesn't get us out of the situation we're in Gaza to begin with.
Ben Rhodes, as always, thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.